Thank you. Awesome. All right. So let me introduce you to a special guest that I have been looking forward to for a long time. Today we're joined by Tamara K. Nopper. And Tamara is a sociologist, a writer, an educator, and an editor. She is currently the senior researcher for labor futures at Data and Society, the editor of We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice, a book by Miriam Kaba's writings and interviews by Haymarket Books, a researcher and writer of several data stories for Colin Kaepernick's Abolition for the People series, an edited book, and guest editor of the recently published critical sociology forum, Race and Money. Tamara's research, academic publications, popular pieces, and public educational lectures focus on data literacy, particularly around crime data, policing and surveillance, the racial wealth gap, Asian American communities, and Black Asian solidarity politics. And frankly, in doing the readings in preparation for today, I can tell you that it's some of the best stuff I've read in a long time, and we will definitely be sharing links to lots of these resources in that data equity community forum a little bit later today, so you can find all those links. So let me stop talking and turn it over to Tamara. I am so grateful that you're taking this hour to be with us today. Tamara, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Heather. And I want to thank Heather and We All Count. And I want to thank all of you for showing up to hear my great speech with the exciting title. I have to warn you, I'm bad with titles. And so it's called My Approach to Data Literacy. I thought, let's just get to the point, right? So this presentation will just briefly describe a bit of my kind of pedagogy around data literacy and the way I approach it, and then show some recent examples of what I think about in terms of data literacy as it relates to kind of education, particularly political education. So I want to start with kind of sorting out how my approach to data literacy differs a little bit from some of the other kind of approaches, but it does incorporate it. So one is, years ago, the American Library Association, they use the term information literacy. And one of the things is, I think this is a very important kind of, concept. And this was something from 1989. And we know, especially with a lot of the political attacks on libraries, political attacks on research, and, kind of reading, and curriculum, information literacy is very, very important. And it is something that, as a professor of sociology, I have started incorporating a lot of data literacy into my courses. I've been doing this for probably now, almost goodness, like 10 years at least, having specifically designed data literacy assignments. So one of the things, for example, in my sociology of research methods course is I do incorporate information literacy part. And in that course, I encourage, we learn about what is peer-reviewed versus a trade press, what does it mean to be peer-reviewed, what is considered kind of a legitimate source, so how do they kind of identify different sources. We also look at changes that are going on in journalism and changes that are going on in kind of publishing to get them to understand, the difference between, let's say, a think piece and something that might be fact-checked, right? And this is something that I think is really important for a lot of my students and for the general public to kind of think about. So that's one aspect of my approach to data literacy, is thinking about kind of, how do we evaluate quote unquote data, and how do we evaluate sources, and to also encourage people to have more of a kind of a vocabulary, not to be shady, but we often see people on social media say things like, do the readings, or some of you haven't read and it shows, right? And I get it. Like sometimes I feel that way too. I got that, tweet in my head, right? But there's a lot of, actual vocabulary that we don't have, or some of the tools we don't always have or get introduced to be able to kind of parse through a lot of the information and sources that we're getting access to today, right? So that's one aspect of my data literacy approach, particularly in the classroom. Another thing is statistical literacy. Now, I have to tell you, when I became a sociology student in undergrad, I was because I was a terrible poet. I had been an English major and I went into college really enjoying reading fiction, loved reading fiction books, liked writing short stories, all this good stuff, right? And then I was just really bad at poetry. And my friends and, the English program would be like, I wrote another poem today. And I was like, oh shit, pardon my language. I'm going to maybe cuss during this presentation, but just know I am not cussing at you. I'm cussing with you. Okay. So, but the thing is, I was like, I got to switch majors, but also I didn't have the vocabulary at the time to just say the English major and the way I was being taught was extremely Eurocentric. I just got sick of reading only white authors for the most part. So I go to join the sociology program, and I felt kind of tricked later when I found out that it was a lot of statistics because don't like math and I'm not the strongest at math, right? And so for me, it was like, oh, I thought we were going to teach about social problems and learn about like how to change the world. That's the way it was marketed to me in the registrar's office, right? So lo and behold, I find out later that it's very methodology driven. There's this whole history of positivism versus, other kind of analytical approaches. And that there's, a lot of math and statistics, and that a lot of times statistical analysis is what's considered equivalent to sociological analysis, right? So, all the qualitative sociologists, solidarity. All right. So, one of the things, though, is that a lot of times data literacy, what I've come to learn is a lot of people equate data with statistics or numeracy. And so, a lot of times when you see kind of data literacy being approached, it's sometimes being approached more from a mathematical perspective, which we know, of course, is also philosophical and political. But it's often, equated with kind of training people how to use kind of statistical software and how to do kind of mathematical analysis. I think this is also a very important thing. I think that mathematical literacy is important, but I think what happens, and this is something that I've kind of thought through and we're going to get more to about my approach when we're talking about some of the examples of my work on crime data, is I think sometimes people can get too caught up in kind of the research method and research design. And so I think it's important to have the tools to be able to kind of analyze and critique that. But I think for, kind of a more political intervention with data literacy, we need to also kind of go beyond just thinking about numeracy. And so one of the things I'm always encouraging my classes to think about is what are examples of data and how do they circulate, whether it's in their conversations, the way that they kind of, decide that they don't like somebody, right? How they decide that something is true, whatever. We're always kind of surrounded by examples of people trying to use what they consider data, even some of the most offensive perspectives, even some of the most politically ridiculous perspectives, right? A lot of people think that they're providing receipts or data. And so this is something about having a more expansive understanding of data beyond just kind of numbers or statistics or percentages, right? While at the same time, I also have worked with my classes about how to read things like tables that are filled with a lot of percentages. And so part of that came from years ago, I was teaching a class called Ethnic Economies and Globalization. A big part of my research is on Black Asian solidarity politics. And a lot of that started by looking at Korean immigrant entrepreneurs in Black neighborhoods and these questions about Black Korean conflict, how did Koreans come to open these businesses, and so forth. That's what took me to a lot of the stuff around financialization, capitalization, the role of the state, and banking. But and the process of that, it meant, being able to look at tables like things like, how comparing business ownership, comparing banking, comparing immigration patterns, right? And I wanted students to do kind of assignments around these tables. And what I found was that a lot of students, they were having a hard time just even kind of reading a table. Which direction do you read the table plays a big part in how you analyze the data in it. And so I started designing data analysis assignments for those particular classes. And I got really great feedback from students. And some of the students, this was at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was an adjunct for years. And some of the students said that they were not being introduced to some of these things in other classes in the social sciences. I taught in the sociology department, and it cross-listed with African American studies and Asian American studies and urban studies. And so I started really thinking about that. And I ended up creating data literacy classes for practically every class I teach, assignment, excuse me. I create scaffolded data literacy assignments for practically every class now. And I have found that students really, uh, the feedback I get from students at least says that they find it very useful. And I also have a whole philosophy about how to approach data literacy in the classroom that I can't really get into here as much, but I do scaffolded assignments. So I do believe in statistical literacy. I do believe in numeracy, and I try to incorporate that into my teaching. But I also want people to think about this concept called bad stats. And this is Dr. Ivory Toldson. And he is a professor who created this, concept called bad stats. I think are actually really useful. And the reason I bring this up is one of the things I try to encourage people to consider, particularly my students, is that, a lot of times we can be dazzled by percent or statistic because there's a way where a lot of times a number kind of gets a certain legitimacy or percent, right? And this is something I encourage my students to think about this, not only in kind of academic research we might be looking at, but also how it circulates broadly on social media, right? So I give them examples of, one of the examples I give was the Biggest Loser TV show. And there was this like controversy about why were they gaining weight back and about looking at the data and so forth about why did they gain this weight back afterwards, right? And, I get them to think about who is producing this information. And so we look at things like who is the source of that data? What might be some of their political interests? What is the way that that data conversation is circulating in the broader public? So I show them some of the social media kind of conversation where a lot of people were like, I told you so, or I knew that this was the case, right? And so forth. And so one of the things is, we look at kind of bad stats broadly. What is a statistic that hasn't really been interrogated for its political function, for the way it circulates, but also the way it's measured, right? And so this is all stuff that I try to bring into kind of thinking about examples of bad stats. In this case, Dr. Tolton was thinking about specifically the way that bad stats circulate in conversations about Black people and public policies regarding racism. And so this is also something I encourage my students to think about is what is the political function of this data and what political project is this data serving or the conversations about the data and the way it's getting circulated and published and narrated. So I'll give you an example. This is the book, The New Jim Crow. And one of the things that Heather mentioned is a lot of my scholarship and work around data literacy has to do with, issues around the criminal punishment system in the United States. And I teach courses in a program that teaches a lot of classes about criminal justice. Criminology is a very big kind of subfield that social scientists have played a big part in. And one of the things is this book, I remember when it came out because I have an experience in history in community organizing and activism around Asian American communities, around immigrant rights. And so I was at different political conferences and academic conferences where this book really took off, right? The New Jim Crow. And it's a book that I think is, a really important book. But this is a statistic that kept getting circulated, or a data point, I should say, that kept getting circulated. And this Color Lines publication was just one example. I've seen celebrities, you know how like sometimes you see celebrities doing a data point at an award show. A lot of times they're working with an organization or a group to kind of get certain talking points to raise kind of issues in connection to, let's say, a film or a project that they're working on, right? And so this is a data point you see cited in books. I've seen it cited at conferences. I've seen it cited on award shows. It circulates kind of broadly. And if you put this data point in, what happens a lot of times is the same data point just keeps getting kind of circulated in the media. And so this is also something I show my students examples of is how does a data talking point start to get taken as like kind of a true talking point, right? It's through sometimes repetition, but through the way that kind of the data point circulates. And so the issue with this data point is she doesn't adjust for kind of proportion in terms of the population at the time. She just uses raw numbers, right? But if you don't know kind of the difference between raw number and thinking about proportion, which is something that a lot of times we're familiar with from maybe taking a research methods course or being trained in kind of, something, that's not something that widely circulates in the general public, right? But the talking points can. And this would be considered kind of an example of a bad stat because it plays a major part in how people think about the criminal punishment system, how people think about kind of racial politics and racial progress today. So, a person who's played a big influence in my kind of conception of data literacy and my pedagogy is Toni Morrison. And that might be a bit surprising because she is mainly known for fiction, even though she wrote very broadly a lot of nonfiction as well as operas and plays and poetry and so forth. But she talks actually a lot about data, and she's made, really interesting points where she said in interviews that moving from data to kind of wisdom is the track of everything she's ever written. And she talks a lot about how part of the purpose of her stories is to kind of have the characters not to have necessarily happy or tidy endings, but where somebody kind of learns something and kind of comes to more knowledge about something, whether it's about themselves, the world, relationships, so forth. And she made this point. She says it's easy and seductive to assume that data is really knowledge, or that information is indeed wisdom, or that knowledge can exist without data, and how easy and how effortlessly one can parade and disguise itself as another. And I love this because I think this is something that can happen a lot of times in conversations that involve data, but also how we think about data. And again, a lot of times there's this idea that like your data is kind of like, boom, I got the evidence or I got the best percentage or I got, this and that, right? And it's often used as a way to try to win in kind of conversations or, research battles and so forth. And there's something about how we use data that I think is also part of this kind of issue around, okay, what does the data tell us? What do we actually know from the data? But also, what is the wisdom we bring? And for me, this is me, right? I can't say for Dr. Morrison, because she didn't always sort out in the different things I've read of hers, she didn't always sort out kind of what she meant by this. So I'm extrapolating what I think, wisdom is here. But I think a lot of times wisdom also involves certain things like humility, right? It also involves a lot of times knowing a lot about a topic beyond just kind of the data point that you're reading, right? To me, some of the people that are the strongest intellectuals who I look up to are people who have read a lot about their topic that can put in conversation, right? And who know a lot about a topic from working in it, researching it, reading about it, that can move back and forth between kind of a data point and can kind of understand how to put that data point into a perspective beyond just seeing the number and getting dazzled by it itself, right? And so she says how easy and how effortlessly one can parade and disguise itself as another. And so this is something that I think the wisdom part is actually, frankly, a lot of kind of, heart work. I think, data analysis is both head work, right, in terms of the analytical and all this stuff. But what we do with the analytical and what we do with the information and when we decide to kind of speak and what we think is important for kind of us to think through, I think that comes from a certain wisdom that you have to kind of cultivate at both an intellectual and kind of an emotional level, frankly. Um, so I'll give you an example of, and I'll use myself, right? I'll give an example of when I failed, right? So, this is, some Maoist stuff. What is it? He talks about like, criticism and self-criticism, right? Let me tell you, criticism, self-criticism can make for some very long meetings, okay? But it's necessary, all right? So I'll use myself as an example of kind of self-criticism and how I did not live up to kind of this ideal here. So early on, if we're now into the fourth year of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And when the COVID-19 pandemic first hit, as people remember, I'm sure, there was speculation about its origins in China and then also Italy. But as the way that it got racialized as connected to, Chinese and this idea of like, the Chinese creating in labs and, the way that President Trump called it Kung flu, right? As well as increased anti-Asian violence. violence against Asian Americans of a variety of ethnicities, being associated with COVID, and being associated with kind of the quote unquote shutdown and so forth, and need to quarantine because of COVID, right? I'm somebody, I have taught in Asian American studies for years. I've taught in Asian American studies, sociology, and ethnic studies for years. And I also, as I have mentioned, come from working in Asian American organizing, and also just as an Asian American in terms of the level of racism I experienced. And I remember at the beginning of 2020, just feeling kind of stressed out, seeing, this kind of growing discourse about China and COVID. And so at that time I was on Twitter. I might return, but I'm taking a break. Like, I'm doing that whole thing like, what do I do about social media? Right. So I'm taking a break right now. Okay. But at the time I was on Twitter and I started tweeting some stuff about the flu. And this is where kind of, I went off track. I knew where to find kind of official flu data. So I have that kind of knowledge, right? I have that kind of, skill set. I know I could go to the CDC. I knew how to kind of look at the data and put some percentages there. And I knew how to make it look smart. And so I got on Twitter and I talked about how we shouldn't, kind of overestimate what's happening with COVID. This is at the very beginning, right? Like in the early 2020. And I said, look how many people have, died from the flu and versus that and this and that, right? And I realized when I looked at that, like maybe a couple weeks later, I deleted the tweet. And part of it was because I realized that I don't know shit about COVID at the time, right? I was not an infectious disease expert. I was not somebody who had been doing all this research. I've come to learn there's a lot of medical research about, the antecedents to COVID, right? I also have come to learn the difference between somebody just saying I'm a medical doctor on Twitter, which they might be, and somebody who's actually an infectious disease expert who works with respiratory infections and certain diseases that circulate in a certain way, right? So I've also developed more of a vocabulary around how people talk about virus interchangeably, and it's not always useful, right? But at the time, I realized I was speaking more out of kind of fear and kind of this kind of growing sense of tension around how Asian Americans were being blamed for COVID. And so I put out a talking data point that on one hand, in terms of the data is quote unquote true, but it lacked knowledge. I didn't know shit, part of my language. I didn't know shit about, COVID-19 at the time. A lot of us didn't, right? And unfortunately, a lot of us still don't, right? In terms of like kind of ignoring all this important data that has been made available to us, right? A lot of us are staying strategically ignorant around COVID, even though now there is more information available to the broader public, right? But what I also lacked was wisdom, right? I knew where I could find the data. I knew where I could make it look smart. And I got retweeted, right? But I look back and one of the things I kicked myself for was I contributed to some of this confusion around COVID, right? At a time where a lot of, the world is trying to figure out what's going on, right? The world is freaking out, understandably so. And where we need more people who actually know the information, but who are also going to think thoughtfully about how to share that information and translate that scientific and medical information to the general public, right? And so this was a really important moment for me in terms of thinking about my own approach to data literacy and kind of clarifying it into thinking about, what Dr. Morrison said here. Um, so this is Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And she is a major figure, for those who don't know, in abolitionist politics. And she's a geographer by training. And she's written a lot about kind of, thinking about abolition, both in terms of state infrastructure and issues of organized abandonment, but also has become somebody who's broadly kind of identified with different abolitionist work. And one of the things that I really loved is she did this interview where she talked about what type of reading do we do? How do we read? And, literacy is a broad term that basically is connected to how we read, but how we interpret and what do we do with the information. And I love what she said here. She said, when it came to political writing and social theory, many of us had become bad readers. On the one hand, we avidly search for guidance in a constellation of thinkers and writers who could show us how to make sense of late modernity's cumulative catastrophes. But in doing so, we tend to extract from the text names, facts, or trends that could command our loyalty, and we imagine the undivided attention of others. We read for allegiance. We read in order to recite. Writing down and tightening our throats around data and phrases. We didn't find ourselves any better at everyday tasks, much less able to rework what we were doing. And plus, we really sounded like cops with mid 1960s sociology degrees. I just found this fascinating because there's a way where, again, sometimes when we think about data literacy, I believe in people reading books and I believe in people, pushing themselves to actually, kind of work through information. I believe very strongly that part of learning is, it's struggle, and that struggle is not always, harm, right? You know what I mean? And I believe that part of learning something is to learn something new, and that to learn something new, you're going to have to kind of do the work and work through it. So I believe that very seriously, right? But one of the things that I get concerned about, as I said, with data literacy, is there's a way where sometimes people can use what we know and what we've read and what we, and the data that we understand as a way to kind of, keep people out of conversations and to exclude people from understanding things. And to me, part of the point of data literacy is we want as many people as possible to kind of understand what's going on, right? And especially if we're thinking about the relationship between kind of knowledge and social movements, knowledge and political change, right? Not just knowledge and politics, because everybody's doing politics, including conservatives, but if we're thinking about knowledge and social change, and we really want this violent world to change for the better, right? Well, it doesn't help to just sit there and be the smartest person in the room, right? You could be, but it's like, that's good, congratulations. But, who's moving with you, right? Like, what kind of victory is that, just to be the smartest person in the room? And then we're still in this, messed up world, right? And so this was something that really spoke to me because I think she was getting at, Dr. Gilmore, a certain way where there can be a certain chauvinism and a certain kind of self-congratulations, right? That sometimes when we find this information or data point, and I unfortunately see a lot of that energy, frankly, on social media in a way that sometimes kind of concerns me. And so this is where some of the work I'm going to share in a moment, it plays a role in kind of some of the political ed workshops I've done around this. She also says, Dr. Gilmore, important for us to put together the most powerful information we can to try to achieve what we want to achieve, but not to confuse facts with power. That the facts that we gather become the political value we need to do the work we're going to do. So it's still about, not just knowing a bunch of stuff, but it's also like, what do we do with this information? How do we also try to connect and relate to others? How do we connect with existing projects? There's a lot of projects that are going on that might not be where we exactly want them to be, but they've helped create infrastructure, build relationships, and also sometimes have created the opening for us, and the condition of possibility for us to even kind of push through even more creatively or politically. Now, and the one last slide about kind of my pedagogy is this comes from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which was a civil rights organization. People like Robert Moses, who played a big math on kind of, thinking about algebra and math literacy on a political level and towards organizing. People like Ella Baker, right, who thought a lot about participatory democracy. I've written about this elsewhere, but participatory democracy is a big part of my framework around data literacy, right? How do you get more and more people to kind of, feel that they can be literate around data on broad strokes, right? And participate in these conversations and have their literacy taken seriously in these conversations, right? Even as we debate and so forth. So one of the things is they had a research committee that was very, very, that did a lot of work with them. And that's not unheard of. A lot of labor unions and organizations have research wings. But what I loved is they talked about not having things be so abstract, dealing with power in very real political ways and not just kind of in discursive ways. So this is from Julian Bond, and he says SNCC had the best research arm of any civil rights organization before or since. Okay, Mr. Bond. Okay, and so field secretaries entered the rural small town South armed with evidence of who controlled and owned what, and who in turn owned them. Quote, power structure was no abstract phrase for SNCC's band of brothers and sisters, but a real list with real people's names and addresses and descriptions of assets and interlocking directorships, demonstrating how large interests, ranging from Memphis and New York banks to the Queen of England, might own at least partial control of a plantation in Mississippi's Delta. Knowledge of who owned what was crucial to SNCC's strategies. From it, we knew that Southern peonage was no accident, but rather the deliberate result of economic policies determined thousands of miles away from the cotton field. And for those who don't know, they did a lot of work organizing people to be able to register to vote, to run for office. And a lot of the folks were sharecroppers and people who were in debt peonage and different properties. And so they were challenging a lot of the infrastructure and political economy around racial violence and class violence. So I'll give you some, I just want to show some examples of data literacy work I've done for the broader public outside of my classroom. This was in April of 2020, so before the pandemic, after my kind of, Twitter gaffe. And Kenyon Farrow is one of my favorite researchers and writers, and he is a public health expert. And he also works a lot in communications policy and health policy. So he's somebody who's actually trained and has done a lot of work around infectious diseases, but working around policies globally and in the United States around big pharma, infectious diseases, and health communications. How do you communicate kind of very complicated health and medical research and policy work to a broader public? So we did a talk about how to think about kind of the fact of Blackness. This is a referral to Frantz Fanon, right? So we're not saying that Blackness is biological or that race is biological, but it's a referral to Frantz Fanon's consideration about anti-Blackness and about how that structures the organization of society. And so this was a really important talk. And one of the things we did in this talk was we just broke down kind of, what is the National Institute of Health? What does the Surgeon General do, right? What is the CDC? And then where is this data coming from? He explained what COVID-19 is, some of the kind of, stuff around this stuff, right? Then this is a talk I did, and these are a range of organizations that I partner with. So I partner with Haymarket Books quite a lot, but these are a whole bunch of different community and political organizations that deal with the criminal punishment system, who are abolitionists, right? And I wanted to do something on crime data because you see a lot of kind of commentary about crime data in terms of the Uniform Crime Report of the FBI. That's what a lot of times, that maybe NYPD data is what gets circulated a lot in the general public. And I wanted to give more of kind of a history of some of the kind of crime data and also break down some of the details about this crime data, right, for the broader public. And one of the things I often do with my lectures is I try to organize them as public educational lectures. So they're literally kind of like almost what I would do in a classroom, except it's not as interactive, obviously. And I try to organize them into like 2 or 3 segments so they can be shown at like 20 minutes to 30 minutes at a time. So it can be kind of taken in doses, and that it could be shown for political ed groups, study groups, and classrooms. And I've had a lot of professors who've reached out to me saying these have been very helpful for their students. This is a talk I did in March 23rd of 2021. And this was after it was something I had proposed to the Asian American Writers Workshop, which works mainly with like fiction and poetry writers and so forth. And they're based in New York City. And I have a long history with them. I used to go up to New York from Philadelphia and do really bad spoken word. And you should all feel grateful that there's no video of me doing that spoken word, okay? But the Asian American Writers Workshop, I had reached out to them because I was thinking about the way that conversations about anti-Asian violence were circulating, but also the growing conversation about anti-Asian violence today and the discourse around hate crimes. And I thought it might be useful for more people to learn about the political history of Asian Americans challenging anti-Asian violence, but also to get more of a handle on the discourse of hate crimes. I'm very critical of using the term hate crime because I think that it proposes carceral solutions. And I'm somebody who thinks we need to challenge racial violence, but I don't know if using the criminal punishment system, one of the greatest purveyors of racial violence, is the best mechanism. So I wanted to break down kind of crime data statistics and hate crime statistics specifically. And this was something that took on kind of a different resonance after the Atlanta massacre, where several Asian sex workers and people who worked at, well, there's debate if they're sex workers, but they worked at massage parlors, and some of them were owners, and some people were people who were at the massage parlors as customers when they were massacred in Atlanta. And this was already in the works being planned, but a lot of people tuned into this. I was told there were about like 2,400 RSVPs because it ran right after, like a week after that happened. And one of the things is I got contacted actually by a lot of journalists because I started breaking down some of the statistics that were circulating in mass media and in mainstream news about kind of the percentage of hate crimes going up or down. And some of them said, we didn't know this, right? They said, we didn't know how to interpret some of those tables. We're kind of having to churn out these stories quickly. And they're using kind of a talking data point that widely circulates, right? So, and so this is an example, and I worked with the Just Journalism Project as a researcher and doing some writing for preliminary writing for publications that they created to work specifically with journalists about how to understand some of the changes in the Uniform Crime Report. So there's a lot of stuff I'm also kind of doing behind the scenes to kind of work with people to think about kind of the way that certain data points get mainstreamed and how to kind of sort through some of that data points, those data points. So this was Punishing Immigrants. This was another collaboration with Haymarket Books. And it was about immigration enforcement in the prison industrial complex. So this is where I broke down a lot of information from Department of Homeland Security and ICE around their data and how to kind of think through some of that data. And then this was with Interrupting Criminalization. It was, I did a presentation on New York City crime statistics and the politics of open data. I wanted people to think more about how kind of the push for open data also makes a lot of this crime data kind of available, but what does that mean in terms of the information that we have available? And so that is the end of my presentation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamara. You can see that there is tons of engagement with participants and really a lot of gratitude for both the stories you're sharing and the way that you shared them. I really, really appreciate that you're here. And so now we have time for live question and answer. So if you are in the Zoom room with us and you want to ask a question, because there's a couple hundred people, rather than everybody turning their mics on, what we're going to suggest is that you raise your hand if you want to ask a question. And there is a kind of a Zoom way to raise your hand. If you look in your Zoom menu where it says reactions, which is like a smiley face with a plus on its head, usually, if you click that, usually there's a place to raise your hand. If you can't find that place, simply put in a put it in the chat that you want to turn your mic on. Or if you have a question and you don't feel like you want to turn your mic on, you can put the question in the chat. So I'm going to give you a minute to do that. And while you do that, I, of course, have about 5 hours of questions that I would like to ask just from reading so many of the works. And I will, there's a lot of requests for the resources. We will put the resources in the forum. And one of the things, feel free to raise your hand if you're in the room, but until then, I'm going to ask some questions. um, okay, great. Go ahead. Christina, hi. Hey, how are you?
Good morning. Thank you for this. I truly enjoyed the presentation. I learned so much. And I was wondering what is the current methodologies or policy efforts toward changing how data is used in terms of misclassifications, especially for all the indigenous tribes on this Turtle Island, North America, and how it's being used toward not bringing equitable designs, especially where funding is concerned, or even just to and reinforce racism. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your question, Christina, but I'm not an expert on kind of, different racial classification data debates. It is something that I pay attention to broadly as a sociologist of race, especially someone who teaches those classes. but there are people who kind of specialize in thinking about census and census changes and the political battles regarding kind of um, census and race and census changes. So a couple people, and you might be familiar with them. One is Dr. Melissa Noble. She has a book called Shades of Citizenship. Dr. Kimberly Tallbear has done a lot about thinking about race and science and kind of different political demands of different indigenous communities in the United States around like how to be classified, which is such an important part of kind of the story is like what are the internal political dynamics that play a role. But it's not something that I have paid close attention to. And, I'm trying to stay in my lane. So I appreciate you supporting me living my best life. Okay, trying to stay in my lane, but thank you so much for the question.
That is such a good answer. We all support you living your best life. And we do actually have somebody who is an expert on that very topic joining us as a guest speaker on May 24th. And so if you're interested, the Zoom link for this Talking Data Equity gathering that we do on Fridays, the Zoom link is always the same. So you can always drop in and out if you're interested. But on the 24th, bring that question back. And we do have somebody who is in that exact lane coming. Okay. I think Mish, your hand was next. Hi, how are you? Oh no, I'm so sorry, Mish. Let's go to Leah. Mish probably has to go get a different mic because somehow our Zoom platform and Mish don't play well together and we don't know why. So go ahead, Leah.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm so grateful to be here. And I had a quick question for Dr. Nopper. When you talk about the context needed in order to interpret data, I find myself struggling with how to bring that into the conversation with people that don't have advanced degrees, particularly in family, without sounding like, well, you just don't know enough, or you have to look harder, or these kinds of things. I think because I have an emotional response first, and so I am working on that. But I'm wondering if you have certain ways that you phrase and invite more context so that the conversation can become more rounded because yeah there's a lot of bad stats out there, and yeah, just wondering how, if you have particular tools that you use to make that inviting, and would love your thoughts. Thank you.
Sure. What I would say is I think like some of the quiet work is like just frankly having a certain level of empathy. Like one of the things I think as an educator, I tend to approach things as an educator. And I say that, I don't believe the world is my classroom because that would just make me an annoying, like pedantic person nonstop. Like, oh, the world's my classroom. No, it's not. Okay. You know what I mean? But so I'm not trying to say that, but I think one is that, there's so much politically out here that we're competing with and that, people are having to sort through. And this is why a lot of times, I try to encourage my students to think about like just how is data circulating around you, even if you don't agree with it, like, can you actually identify the logic that somebody's kind of coming to come to their conclusion? But also this is why I unpack a lot of stuff for my classes about like, and also in the political ed, workshops for the broader public is how is this stuff even being kind of made available to us and marketed and so forth, right? And it's not meant to be kind of a gotcha or an aha because I just frankly don't think that works as an educator. You might teach some people some things, but I think it's really important to think about how can you educate without teaching a lesson, because teaching a lesson comes from that kind of like, I'm going to win and I want to kind of, a gotcha type of stuff. I don't think that really makes people want to learn, frankly. And, you can't control people want to learn, but I don't think that helps. But what I would say is, one of the things I appreciate about Dr. Gilmore's approach to abolition is she often talks about that it's about identifying what already exists and what is there and the kind of working with that and trying to infiltrate that in different ways, right? And the reason I say that is a lot of people have things that they know about. Does that mean that I agree with the stuff or that I think that they know a lot about a certain topic? No, we have a, I don't always think that. But it's about kind of working with what they give you and starting with that. So I think there's that importance. And when I'm saying like with data literacy, I'm talking about, I'll give Kenyan Pharaoh as an example, right? When COVID started and just even now, um, I'm just going to say it, and I'm not trying to be shady when I say this, but a lot of people in the last so many years have um, increased their platform publicly by talking about either COVID or carcerality. These are kind of two of the major areas, right? And there's, different reasons for that. But one of the things I came to learn was like, wow, like there's a real difference between like infectious disease experts and then also how people talk about viruses, all this stuff, some of the stuff I said before. And one of the things about Kenyon's work that I've appreciated is he's somebody who's really steeped in not just kind of public health knowledge and medical. He's reading all these medical research things behind the scenes, knows about clinical trials, all this stuff. And he's not a medical doctor, right? He doesn't have a doctorate. He doesn't have a master's, right? But he also has worked in communities. He's also done policy work with CDC, all this stuff, right? And he also knows a lot about kind of the history of race politics and racial justice. So I'll give you an example. When Kyrie Irving was doing some of his kind of vaccine, stuff, and there's all these debates about vaccine hesitancy and what's causing that, there was knowledge that Kenyon had because of his work in, race scholarship and also his work taking seriously kind of, Black politics and Black history, that some of the ways that he could interpret what was going on in Kyrie Irving's stuff, right? Like, some of the discourses and so forth is very different than somebody else who just says vaccine hesitancy, but they have no knowledge of kind of some of the racial discourses around health, around medical care, around this and that like people, all these people, Black Panthers, the Young Lords, all these people were debating how to explain kind of health and kind of health inequality, right? Kenyon is steeped in a lot of that knowledge, as well as having worked in community organizations. And so that's an example of what I'm getting at about like knowing a lot about different things to be able to kind of put certain data points in perspective in a much richer and political and grounded way, but also, frankly, sometimes in a more empathetic way. Even if you don't agree with something, you actually kind of have more of an understanding of where something's coming from. That's what I was kind of getting at there. But as far as kind of, talking to maybe family members or friends about it, I think, part of it is just kind of having empathy, thinking about what is it that they do know, learning from them about like how did they come to think about these things, right? And sometimes they might reveal to you like what are different ways that they have come to understand that, and that they might actually reveal to you some things about the data or about how to think about the data as well as knowledge that you might not have even realized that they had about a topic. And so I would just say that might be approach to kind of interpersonal relationships.
Great advice. Great answer. Mish, any luck with the mic? I don't think we do. So I think, given the fact that we can't get Mish on a mic, and it is like 3 minutes to one. We try and end a minute or two early because we know how many of you have back to back, and we're trying to help all of us live our best lives so that we can eat something or take a breath. Oh, Mish, any luck? You're back? No.
Heather, do you mind if I take the one question quickly about the
Ab
data?
I'd love it. Yeah, go ahead. For sure.
So one of the things is like, I hate yoga, but I'm trying to do it more because it's supposed to be good for us and I'm getting older and all this stuff, right? So one of the things is I totally sound like a yoga bobblehead in real life. You'd think I'd love yoga, right? But I started doing these data literacy assignments years ago, as I mentioned, but I started turning them into scaffolded assignments. So that way students could build strength, have chances to kind of, get feedback, work towards something, right? This is the yoga bobblehead, kind of perspective. But it was partly, I didn't actually start doing the scaffolded assignments until I took a teaching writing in the classroom workshop, right? And, I had already taught writing intensive classes and worked at like the writing center in grad school and all this stuff. But, one of the things that the teacher said, he was teaching all college professors, his colleagues, right? In the summer workshop, it was like 5 days, intensive summer workshop. And he said, we're getting students to kind of not only learn new material, but we're also getting them to write about it and to have to like actually write about that. And then sometimes what are our expectations? So he was the one who really encouraged us to design scaffold assignments. And it was a game changer for me, both in terms of how I approach kind of just assignments in general, but also it sharpened my pedagogy around data literacy. Because even though I thought I was doing like a great job in terms of like just introducing students to things, I realized I still had to parse out different stuff. So what I do is I do workshops in the classroom for each section. There's 3 sections. Um, and we learn things like what is a sample, what is a method, how to kind of read tables. We do a lot of group work. And we go through each kind of part of the assignment as a class. It's very interactive. Then they write a part, it's high stakes, low stakes. They get feedback, and then they build towards the final assignment, right? I will say one thing I did do in my sociology of research methods class I really liked was in that class, I had them creating infographics. So we learned Canvas software, some, kind of not too complicated software. We literally drew storyboards. So they had to pick a topic that they wanted to do. They had to find a research, source. This is where we did a whole workshop on kind of how to find a legitimate research source, right? And where to look for data. And we did storyboarding. So we literally like I brought pencil and paper and they were drawing story and they loved the students were like, this was one of the funnest parts of the thing. And then they did their infographics. We would do a lot of in-class stuff on infographics, looking at them together, giving each other feedback, right? And so they also learned, and one of the things I try to do in all my classes is learn just not only content, but what is like one skill that I'm kind of working with you on to kind of develop. So in that class, it was learning the software, right? And then they had a major assignment at the end. But I got such positive feedback, and it was also just fun for me to teach. So that is my approach, but I would say the scaffolded assignment and the yoga bobblehead approach actually, I think, has helped improve my teaching of data literacy. And I think it's improved the student experience from what they've shared.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share that in such detail. I think that answer is really helpful in terms of people who are trying to teach data literacy to others. And then it also really circles back to Leah's question about, how do you respond to somebody that's not really data literate, that's trying to use data literacy? I think sometimes as maybe a statistician, I might try and educate them on all the parts and they're like the scaffolding, pick one thing and then go to the next thing and then go to the next thing. Okay, we are going to leave it there. I really am so grateful, Tamara, and you can see that hundreds of other people are as well. You're getting lots of love in the chat.
Thank you, everybody.
Really appreciate you spending time with us today. For everybody who's interested, again, we are back next Friday, same Zoom link. We have somebody who's going to share their direct experience of doing a program evaluation in collaboration with a First Nations tribe. So that will be same basic topic, slightly different flavor. And thanks for coming. It is great to know that each one of you is not alone. There's a whole group of people that are trying to do data with some equity. And I hope you have a great rest of your day and take really good care of yourself and each other. Bye, everybody.